Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ARA's first international webinar. We are delighted today to welcome Bernard Tabary. Bernard is Keolis Downer's Group Executive Director International, and he's here to speak to us today on Road Out of COVID, sharing best practice in rail. My name is Emma Woods, and I'm the Director of Corporate Services here at the ARA, and I'm going to facilitate today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional landowners on which we virtually meet today. The ARA office is based in Canberra, and so for us it's the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like any good webinar, we aim to make it interactive. So throughout the session, you can ask questions by selecting the question tab on the right-hand side of your screen. If you select the little triangle on the top left, it'll expand out and you'll be able to type in as many questions as you wish. We will ask those of Bernard at the end of today's session. You can adjust your audio by selecting the audio tab, and we've also provided the presentation that Bernard will talk to today under handouts, so you're able to download and keep that for a reference for later. Our webinar is live. We have Bernard dialing in from Paris. But if you have any troubles and need some technical support, lodge a question and our support team will do their best to come back to you directly. So without further housekeeping matters, I'm pleased to introduce to you today Bernard Tabary. Bernard has an impressive career within the transport industry. He joined Keolis Group in 2006 as Deputy Managing Director. He was then made Managing Director in 2007, and he was appointed into his current role of Group Executive Director International in 2011. Bernard's here to share with us the global experience of Keolis Downer in working through COVID-19 and how the Keolis Downer team and operations have worked to attract, or are working to attract passengers back to public transport. So without further ado, I will hand over to Bernard. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and a very good afternoon to all of you. A very good morning for whoever is in Europe. Here in sunny Paris, it is 8:30 in the morning, and starting with a glorious sunny day. I was asked to have the Eiffel Tower outside my window, but unfortunately our office is not next to the Eiffel Tower, so you'll have to make do with the shades in the background. And it is a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to share with the prestigious ARA audience. I'm impressed looking at the number of webinars that have been held in the last few months to see how active the association has been. And I'll really be looking forward to, of course, this sharing opportunity, very much so through the Q&As at the end of the presentation. And looking back at this first half of the year, you know, if there are any lessons that we can draw from this awful crisis that we're going through, basically, I would just name three attributes which look to me as essential, which are humility, vigilance, and agility. But I'll come back to this. And what I will do through this presentation is share with you quickly who Keolis is, what impact of C-19 we've experienced so far, our recipes of collaboration and partnership, our specific experience with PTAs, and how moving forward we can go towards regaining PTAs' trust. But perhaps ahead of going into the presentation, let me pause for a quick minute with all of you to reflect on all the victims of this awful crisis. At Keolis, we have had 9 fatalities. 6 in Sweden, 3 in France, and beyond the duress for families, relatives, and colleagues, we see also the economic hardship that this crisis generates, and it is worth reflecting on this just for a quick moment. Thank you. Well, let us have a quick look at first who is Keolis for those who are not very familiar. Basically, our line of business is what? Our line of business is to enhance the livability and attractiveness of cities and states where we operate through mobility solutions. So the ultimate goal is really to enhance that livability and attractiveness, and the mean to that is to operate various modes of transport, be they trains, metros, tramways, buses, ferries, bicycles. Our religion is that of safety, of course, and the passenger, i.e. think like a passenger and put the passenger at the center of our approach, which is what we do in 15 countries. And I'm in charge of the activities of Keolis outside France. We have about 68,000 staff, and we operate 10 transport modes and move around the 3.4 billion passengers every year, so a sizable number. And if we move on to what we do in Australia, we've been lucky as Keolis to operate in Australia since 2009 with our partner Downer, a partner of over 10 years, a very solid partner with whom we are proud to be associated, and with whom we manage a variety of networks in Queensland, in New South Wales, in Victoria, in South Australia, and in Western Australia also. Almost 5,000 staff, and about 250 million passengers carried every year on our networks. Now, moving on to where where COVID stands as far as Keolis is concerned, I've just put here a few countries that we are operating in, and to show perhaps a perspective. And really, Australia and New Zealand stand out as such a low number of cases. I think it's about slightly over almost 7,500 in Australia for 102 deaths. In France, with a ratio of population to Australia of about 2.5, there's 150 or almost 160,000 cases with 29,000 deaths. In the US, we are looking at 2.2 million cases with almost 120,000 deaths, and in India, 380,000 cases and 12,000 deaths, unfortunately growing. And here, hats off to countries like Australia and New Zealand, which, thanks to their very good management of the pandemics globally, have been able to anticipate what was coming up. I was visiting the region at the beginning of March, and I was just ahead of the crisis really starting in Western countries, and I was very impressed, if you like, with the anticipation that I sensed with PTAs and the good organization. And again, well, both Australia and New Zealand stand out today in the world as managing the crisis very effectively. Congratulations to them. But as far as the impact of the crisis on our networks, if we move on to the impact we have seen in the reduction of patronage, the reduction of patronage has been huge on public transport networks, basically ranging from 60 to 90%, with some networks totally stopped, particularly, for example, in Qatar and in India. In general, PTAs have asked us to continue to operate the networks because of their essential service nature, which is understandable. But of course, in the period where the crisis was at a peak, services may have been running at say on Sunday schedules, but with a very low ridership, and the challenges, of course, that came with it. When talking about Australia, the impact has been similar in terms of ridership drop, with ridership drops perhaps lower than the average in the world, but really going from 20% to 70 or 80%, a very significant impact, of course. And as far as Keolis is concerned, we were lucky that since we operate in Shanghai with our partner Shenhtong Metro, we operate 2 metro lines and 2 tramway lines. We saw early on in January what was starting to happen. And in fact, we even helped our Chinese colleagues at the moment shipping out to them face masks and gel, which they were in shortage of. And we're quite happy later in April to benefit from their shipments in turn. But observing the crisis that they were going through early in January had given us a sense, an ability to some extent to anticipate, although experience there tells you that you indeed never anticipate enough. Now, moving on then to beyond this crisis, these numbers and these impacts, the recipes that have come out as helpful in such circumstances are linked really to collaboration and partnership. And this is one of I would say the bright sides of this crisis, i.e. the ability that we have had to share best practices with others. And I'm thinking of the couple of sessions we've been able to hold in Australia with our PTAs, with the IRA, with UITP, with and our Chinese, our German, French networks, so that we could look at, if you like, good situations and good experiences and restoration of trust. But if I look at all categories of stakeholders that we work with, we observe with satisfaction and with pride that all categories have really risen to the opportunity. I'm thinking first of staff who, in such circumstances, demonstrate a high level of engagement. We've seen absenteeism levels drop significantly. We've seen people take courageous stances by agreeing to operate services in uncertain environments. We've seen our colleagues in Perth take care of the evacuation of cruise ships passengers in Fremantle. We have worked also very well with unions, and their unions in general have been also extremely responsive in the face of a very tough crisis. And I'm just thinking of the nice endorsements we've been receiving, say, from the RTBU in New South Wales for our cooperation in Newcastle, but also in many other countries where unions have been proactive in helping us amend work practices when necessary, again in the face of an emergency. But beyond those, of course, I'm thinking of the manufacturers who've been helpful in ensuring that the supply chain was not broken and that we could have enough spare parts to maintain the rolling stock that we had to operate. But I'm thinking also of the service providers, the facility management companies, the cleaners, our colleagues in advertising such as JC Decaux, who have been strong also, and also fellow operators. We are lucky to be in an industry where indeed we do compete at the time of bids, but when the time comes to manage a crisis like this, we have found a good level of solidarity with our fellow operators, and at times have even organized the procurement of face masks or various material together to leverage on volumes and on the emergency. And also, luckily, we've been able to draw on the best practices not only of our networks within Keolis, but also of our parent SNCF, which is the French state-owned railway, and that runs 15,000 trains a day. That is in pre-COVID days, and their experience also has been very helpful. But beyond, if I move on to this collaboration and partnership, I should name, of course, first and foremost, our clients, PTAs, who, and there, as Keolis, we have about 300 contracts worldwide with public transport authorities. In the circumstances, we have had to renegotiate over 40 contracts in emergencies with various solutions. We have gross contracts, net contracts, PPPs. So there's no one size fits all. But what has been important there was really to understand that PTAs are themselves in a very challenging environment, i.e. in their own environment, struggling for resources along with education, health, economy within their own regions or cities, and with uncertainties over their revenues and their investments. And there, the saying in French is, the one who's, well, selfishness is defined by qualifying those who don't think about me. And therefore, not to be selfish in such circumstances, it was important to understand the constraints of our own PTAs, to be able to sit down with them and look at how we could manage the schizophrenic approach of, on one hand, asking people not to travel on public transport, but on the other hand, ensuring that public transport was still running at full service, or at least at on Sunday services. And then, if we move on to the next slide, we have been pleased to, even in the circumstances, be able to extend some of our contracts with our PTAs. I'm thinking in Washington with the rail services out of Southwest Washington with Virginia Railway Express, in London with TfL for Dockland Light Rail, in Boston, sorry, with the MBTA. There where extensions have been granted in the light of still a difficult environment, but one where flexibility was the order of the day. And then if I look at the key challenge, moving on to the next slide, which we now all face, is how do we regain passengers' trust, and how do we bring them back to public transport, which again, ensuring that the attractiveness and the livability of their cities is maximized. So first and foremost, the number one issue is safety, safety, and safety. Safety of our passengers, safety of our staff, and we were pleased that the scheme devised by the Victorian state government on working for Victoria allowed us to hire almost 200, even up to 300 positions for cleaning on the network of the 1,200 tram stops on the Melbourne network. Safety comes with offering a safe environment, a clean environment. I'm pleased here that public transport may have come across initially as, very threatening in the minds of many, logically so. Yet I'm yet to read about any cluster that would have been identified because of a public transport voyage by passengers who would have been infected. And there, moving on, that safety is a lot around anticipating, disinfecting, be it in Boston, be it in Wales, be it on the Gold Coast, in Bordeaux, in Newcastle, in the Greater Paris area. The photos here show people cleaning, and our experience is that it is one of the features that has been best received by passengers. We had very nice expressions of encouragement on the Gold Coast of passengers towards the cleaners, because they are a gentle and positive reminder to travelers of the need to be careful. They are much better, if you like, than individuals standing on the platform and giving instructions which are needed, but are not necessarily as well received as those who are seen with masks around and cleaning and preparing the environment for a safe journey. And moving on, then, that safe journey or that cleaning and disinfecting then uses all sorts of features, such as contactless gel dispensers, UV lights, cleaning with ozone, etc. So we become experts at how the droplets may go around a vehicle through air conditioning, and how do you minimize this, the danger of this by orienting the vents in the proper way, and ensuring that air is captured at the proper places. So all sorts of technical approaches which are important, and not only devices such as the ones that we see here, but if we move on to the next one, also what has been very useful is nudges. Well, signage, of course, signage to help people identify where they should stand and where they should be, but also moving on to the next one, nudges which are a good way to encourage people into positive behaviors through a smiling approach, not through a threatening one. And that is always well received and well followed. Beyond those, what we have, if you like, beyond these tools, is also a lot around information. Information to reassure passengers. So apps of all sorts that inform passengers about schedules, trains, etc., but also anticipating flows, changes of timetables, and in short, and if we go to the next one, really anticipating adapting, if you like, public transport to the new needs and expectations of users. And what we observe worldwide, of course, is a trend towards working from home, and citizens who want to move away from the city epicenters. And then we have already conducted quite a few studies, which at first were very humbling when we saw that passenger transport was rated in the same category as nightclubs when it came to the perception of safety. Well, we love nightclubs, but indeed they don't come across as particularly safe. And our challenge collectively is to ensure that passengers see us with a more positive eye. And I'll come to the next slides to a couple of initiatives or approaches that we have seen as working well. One, of course, has been to adjust prices, always in conjunction with our PTAs. I mean, they are the ones who set the fares and who make those decisions. But whenever we manage to encourage off-peak traveling through passes which are adjusted to lower prices on off-peak. Also the development of digital ticketing. But beyond that, information to users such as the one we see on the next slide, i.e. giving information on patronage within the carriages themselves, real-time occupancy of rail cars or metros, so that people can identify where they will find less crowded space. And of course, not looking at just public transport itself, but if we move on to the next, looking at the complement to public transport, i.e. alternative mobility modes, last mile collections, be they scooters, bicycles, rideshare, walking, of course. We have seen in Shanghai where traffic, which was one of our first operations, of course, to stop, but also to resume, that big traffic congestion became the issue in the city as soon as offices were reopening, and the challenge that cities face is how to avoid congestion on roads, but how to keep mobility solutions alive and rich for passengers. So in short, what we have observed, if you like, is that one really needed to think outside of the box, i.e. it's not one size fits all. it's not one solution is absolutely universal and will fit all environments. I was talking about three attributes which are to me essential, i.e. humility, vigilance, and agility. Humility, because we see that C19 is stronger than us in terms of spikes, as are unfortunately observed at the moment in some countries or in some states. Wave number 2, and the uncertainty around C19, as well as solutions which are found are not usually just universal. They have to be adapted to circumstances. Vigilance, because it doesn't take much for things to go off track. We have had to face the challenges early on in the crisis of some of our operating centers having contaminated agents. And if you need to close down your operation center, then it is really bad news. And so one as an operator can become extremely fragile on points that have to be anticipated, and the danger strikes where you don't expect it. And with that vigilance comes endurance, because it is not a sprint. It is a long-term plague and a long-term issue that has to be dealt with determination and patience. And when I say agility, is there also the ability to come up with new solutions, and on that we offer all sorts of to our various subsidiaries good operations practices, maintenance, tariffs, working with passengers, but also working with PTAs. And in Australia, we're lucky to work with Transport for New South Wales, with the Department of Transport in Victoria, with the Department of Transport and Main Roads, with PTA West Australia, and with DIPTI. It's important to be aligned, if you like, with what the expectations are and what the funding constraints are of the PTAs, to be collaborative, to be agile. So as much as this crisis, if you like, is a very sad occurrence, and again, I'm thinking of all the hardship created by the crisis, what does generate some optimism for us is to see the tremendous amount of innovation, resilience, collaboration that has gone into basically ensuring that our key mission, which is again to enhance the attractiveness and livability of the cities where we operate, that mission is preserved and deployed in the future in different ways. I was very happy to be able to share these views with you, but I'll be even happier to take your questions, and over to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bernard. That's certainly a very broad topic that you've managed to cover really succinctly, and we've certainly had a number of questions come through. You finished up talking about some of the innovations that have been spurred on as a result of COVID-19. What have been some of the standouts, and what do you think might be here to stay?
Well, the innovations have been numerous, and they're still coming in droves. Let me give you a few examples. We are seeing in Holland at the moment an interesting approach to manage to spread the peaks. On which are, of course, bringing lots of people on public transport at one time. Well, government is at the moment looking at changing school times from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And reopening schools later at night. That's for the elder students, and therefore ensuring that that big portion of public transport patronage is on off-peak hours. And this is something that we had experienced in Rennes, in France, also working with where on the metro managing the hyperpeak was extremely challenging, and by working with the university and changing the times of the courses at university, we managed to spread the hyperpeak over an hour instead of having it over 15 minutes, and then suddenly that gives a relief, which is avoiding further investments or expensive investments. That has been a simple innovation. It doesn't cost much, but that takes collective thinking. We've seen good apps also with passenger counting or passenger weighing on carriages, allowing one to know where lower occupancy is on the train, and we've seen this on the Thameslink with the Siemens trains, the 700s, and that is a good an interesting way of ensuring that passengers can spread around the train. We have seen. I was talking about these changes in tariffs, and I know that this is being looked at for Opal in New South Wales at the moment. So truly, when you start and not to talk about the way to collect fares on buses that we have seen in France or in Denmark, where you don't yet have electronic ticketing. So a series of if you like, amazing innovations that usually come from the ground, and one with which one has to be able to listen to, promote, and of course share with others so that they can be deployed.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we're certainly in New South Wales, they're looking at introducing the half-price fares to encourage that off-peak travel. You touched on sort of the changing of school hours, and an issue that's been raised here in Australia is school students and the view that school students don't socially distance. One of our members, Transdev in Auckland, introduced school student-specific carriages. Have there been sort of school-specific initiatives that you're aware of that have been successful around the world?
Well, around the world we have seen, and it's good on New Zealand that the schools have reopened. But I'm looking at the number of countries where we operate. Most schools are still not reopened, and same for universities. As you know, in the US, universities will only reopen in the fall. The fall will be in the northern hemisphere, the start of the year. So there's the countries where schools have reopened are few. In France, schools are now reopening only today, well, in full today on the 22nd of June, with 2 weeks of school to go. And what we've seen there is more around nudges. And nudges are a good way to again get people to, if you like, work with the new practices in a positive way. One point about social distancing: it is, interesting to observe that social distancing in France is 1 meter. In the Netherlands or in Belgium is 1.5 meters. In the UK is 2 meters, and in Switzerland is 2.5 meters, which says a lot about the French who love hugging and kissing all the time, and 1 meter is enough for them. So what is the appropriate social distancing? Our view on that is the best beyond social distancing. We feel that face masks is certainly one of the recipes that is the most reassuring and works well.
You actually have just launched into a couple of the questions that have come in. There's been varied views around face masks on public transport, and you've just touched on the different social distancing requirements. But so is that the position of Keolis, Dana, that face masks should be worn on public transport?
There is not a position of Keolis down there on face masks. There may be the position of PTAs, of governments, but we're not scientists, we're not doctors, and we don't know better than others. And by the way, we operate trains in Wales. Face masks are compulsory in England in public transport, but they are not in Wales. And we do operate trains that go from Wales, say, to Manchester. So we have to, if you like, make do with the challenge of enforcing on the English side and being soft on the well side. So not up to us to judge, but what we and we respect the laws or the regulations that are required by governments. But what we observe is that the face masks do have, beyond their, what scientists say, in terms of behaviors for passengers, they have a very reassuring aspect, and they reinforce, in a way, vigilance. So we are, when asked for an opinion, yes, it is something that we encourage as much as possible.
It's certainly been one that's been an evolving topic here and globally. If we sort of look at, you sort of touched on some of the measures that operators can implement and that Keolis has been implementing globally to attract people back. You talked about safety, and obviously we've just touched on masks. Do you think we'll get back to the patronage levels that we were at pre-COVID? And what sort of further arrangements do you think will be required to continue attracting people back to public transport?
Yeah, that's it's a very important question indeed, because the idea is, again, public transport is not an end in itself. Public transport is the mean to a very livable city and to a pleasant city. So and up to us there, not to just look at pure numbers, but how we work intelligently also with other modes and with the city's objective. Now, going back to patronage levels of pre-COVID may take time, although, suddenly if the appearance of a vaccine may suddenly make people a lot more comfortable, and that could accelerate things. I was traveling last week on a flight to Amsterdam from Paris, and on the way up, I was sitting behind a passenger who was wearing a face mask, but also huge goggles and a big overall like you'd have in a hospital. And then it was tempting to make fun, but you never know how that person feels. It was strange to observe. But what was strange to observe also was that whereas within the terminal, social distancing was encouraged and even monitored closely, once you were on the plane and the plane was full on the way up, it was the traditional flights as we've ever known them, i.e. people pushing one another and struggling to get their luggage, and there no one seeming uncomfortable, yet keen to travel, and in what was a full plane on the way up and a relatively empty one on the way back, and in very empty airports. But I imagine that patronage indeed will come back. We do see that we're at about 80% in China at the moment. We are at 50 to 60% in Germany, and there with schools that have not reopened. So I'm confident it will come back with time.
With time, no, we certainly hope so. How do you, from a contractual perspective, obviously, fare box and the risk of fare box has been an issue for some contracts. How do you see the change to the allocation of risk in public transport contracts as a result of the COVID experience?
It's a good question also, because it's challenging for everyone, i.e. it's challenging for us, but it's challenging for the PTA also. And what is the new normal? How do you go back to references which make sense? It doesn't make sense to be on patronages of yesterday, and those are references that are overtaken by facts. And yet at the same time, it is our role to, as an operator, to ensure that passengers feel safe, that they come back to public transport. So really, it's one by one that we have these conversations. Traditionally, we've had emergency measures agreement negotiated with PTAs for, I would say, usually interim measures, i.e. to the end of 2020. And what we are engaging on at the moment is how do we take into account the new situation to adjust the remuneration that is a sufficiently strong incentive for us to perform, but at the same time makes us bear risks that are reasonable and compatible with the level of remuneration. So lots of talks at the moment, and many more to come. But on that, again, I'm happy that none of our PTAs that we work with we've never been so far in a situation where our contract would be ended or that we'd end up in court. This is not the idea. The idea is to find solutions, and that's what we're working on.
Yeah, and to be agile, as you sort of highlighted in your presentation. What about, we've had a question around talking about obviously the safe distancing and all the additional cleaning that's been required. Do you think that will have an impact on fares that will be charged?
I don't know how it is in Australia. I can tell you that it is for hairdressers in France who have taken up their rates by €3. So for the reproduction of the masks and of the distancing and so on. So you see that some services have, but well, as you know, fares in public transport are a reflection of cost to an extent, i.e. it's an activity where fares rarely cover the full operating costs, and the setting of fares in the end is a political decision. So on that, we can make suggestions, but the decision is not ours. Is the cost of the cleaning measures very high? It can go up. It can be heavy, but certainly not as much as the cost of a job of patronage. And with a 50% occupancy, it's hard to be on the same economics as yesterday. So at some stage, that decision will have to be made again by PTAs, and we'll have our suggestions of experiences of what's been done here or there, without necessarily referring to hairdressers only.
Yes, we had a rule initially introduced for 30 limit hairdressing appointments, and that was quickly expanded. I think there's a little further work done to realize you can't do much in half an hour, at least not for someone who's coloring their hair. Have you noticed any distinct differences between operations within a metro area versus operations in regional towns or cities?
Perhaps the differences that we have observed are mainly linked to basically the health situations, and where the health statistics are good, the attitudes are more relaxed, and where they so more than the residential or metropolitan or rural, it's very much you know, what's the flavor at the moment in trends, in statistics, and that colors the approach. So and on that, you know, I was talking about agility. That's what requires us also to be very agile, and we do see areas where everything was going well and suddenly things are not well anymore, or statistics are bad, and then we need to adjust fast.
What about, we've had a couple of questions come through about staff. This one specifically says, like Keolis, many operators have been impressed by the lift in performance of their teams to address the many unprecedented challenges of COVID. Has Keolis Downer considered how to support their performance and can ensure that it continues into the future?
That's an excellent question, because well, we are in the service industry, and we are very dependent, and our passengers will feel the way our staff do. And it's been nice to observe our essential services, of course, first and foremost health, but also environment, water, and waste collection, and transport have suddenly been acknowledged more by the environment in general. And what we, I think, need to draw from this is the way by which we give constant positive reinforcement to those who day in, day out, because it is the nature of public transport to start very early, to finish late at night, and to be endurant. So the key for us is you know, how do we keep that positive reinforcement? One of the observations is of course being out in the field and meeting people, acknowledging people, using good tools such as Zoom, Teams, and then others to make people understand that they're not alone, that they are taken care of, that their issues are taken care of quickly. I'll give you a couple of examples. In several cities in Europe, at the height of the peak, when the patronage was very low on networks, but yet the networks were running, we did have in a few cities networks which were starting to be occupied by the homeless or gangs trying to do some traffic there. And then we've had to work very quickly with the local police and with our security services to ensure that, and this was not specific to a country, it happened in several instances, and we're able to share experiences from networks so that the environment remained safe. And so the key lesson is really listening to what's happening on the ground, talking to people, giving them reinforcement, taking their advice. The good recipes that we have found have really have been suggested on the ground, not in glorious head offices, which anyway were empty.
One final question from a staffing perspective. What would you say has been your proudest moment in seeing how your staff have responded to COVID-19?
Well, we've been very moved by you know, our bus drivers in Fremantle driving the buses to carry the passengers of the cruise ships who were really identified as a threat. And you know, hats off to those who went out and carried out that service. We also the #1 ambulance operator in France, and there we've been impressed, if you like, by the sheer courage of our staff carrying the sick and in very uncertain conditions. So there are many unknown or unsung heroes around, and we never recognize them enough. But for those that we see and are happy to recognize, we're very proud of them, and that's what you know is fueling our optimism and resilience.
Yeah, the unsung heroes is certainly something we've been, you know, a conversation we've been having with our passenger operator members here in Australia and New Zealand, and how do we recognise all these people behind the scenes, as you mentioned, of, you know, ensure that the networks have continued operating throughout COVID. This one's a bit more specific, but it's an interesting question. So, as a result of COVID-19, do you think the design of vehicles might change in the future?
Yeah, that's of course a good question, and one also to raise with manufacturers. Yes, I imagine it will. I'm looking at just seating on seating on metros, for example. If you do have, you know, if you have the rows on the sides as opposed to series of seats in the middle of the carriage, the number of we've observed that you know, seating has an impact of about 15% on the patronage on the metro in capacity, but also in comfort and in if you like in that perception of safety. So that is one of the approaches where we'll have to be creative and look at what makes people, you know, handlebars that will have several several options for people to grab them, i.e. Triple or quadruple bars that can be held by many hands rather than one. You even have in China this app which will on the bus monitor your heartbeat when you hold the handle, and can monitor your health or your heartbeat from one trip to the other. So that's a bit of a gimmick, but yes, there will be innovations without any doubt. There will be evolutions, and then we'll have to listen to our passengers, we'll have to listen to our staff, and we'll have to talk to manufacturers and to PTAs to ensure that these are deployed.
What about, you know, the topic of your session is obviously the road out of COVID. From a business strategy perspective, what are your thinking in terms of recovery out of COVID from a Keolis Downer perspective?
Well, as much as for the recovery, as much as, if you like, breeding confidence with our passengers and with our staff, breeding confidence with our shareholders is also an important element of longevity. And breeding confidence with our shareholders means showing them a perspective of both, first, cash, and where do we stand on the cash. And I guess cash is going to be the key issue for all companies in the months to come. So what's the cash position? Hence the importance of working well with banks as other partners. But what sort of a business model are we going to be able to talk about tomorrow? So priority number one is first manage the crisis and manage it well, and then be able to look at scenarios of what tomorrow is likely to be in terms of risk taking, in terms of remuneration, in terms of cash impact. And there we're lucky that our two shareholders are, long-term shareholders, be they SNCF at 70% or CDPQ, the Canadian pension fund, for 30%. So they've announced or confirmed their absolute interest in Keolis, and they decide to, support us all along. And not that we are suffering as anyone else, but we are still healthy and alive and kicking for this year and the year to come. And our covenants have been renegotiated, and our credit facilities have been negotiated also. So we have visibility, but clearly breeding that confidence in with our shareholders is a key to our long-term growth.
And the renegotiation of those 3 contracts that you mentioned would certainly help to, the future as well.
Yes.
We've had a question that sort of branches into automated vehicles. And do you think that COVID would accelerate the introduction and acceptance of automated vehicles for passenger and freight transport? And how is Keolis involved in these areas?
Well, autonomous vehicles are, if you like, were there before COVID, and in fact we've had on trial, and we have on trial several autonomous vehicles in several countries and in several cities, and they bring a benefit in terms of hours of operation, flexibility, which is great. They will inevitably, and we've seen this also, draw a bit of puzzlement over their cleanliness and safety, and who's been there before, and how comfortable am I? And it's the same as Airbnb will have to face on apartments or whatever. How do you reassure people who come on board that they are safe? They are, for me, an important complement to our passenger services, but also to the flexibility of our operations and to our operating abilities. So it's hard for me to assess whether it'll be COVID will be a strong accelerator of such, but without any doubt, it certainly won't kill it. I would imagine the opposite. I'm yet to assess, if you like, the impacts that it will have in terms of acceleration, but it will no doubt contribute to their development.
What about you? You spoke about the different social distancing requirements. In France, it's 1 metre. Here in Australia, it's 1.5. We've had a question around how is Keolis Downer managing the limits on trains and trams in terms of capacities in different countries to meet social distancing requirements?
It's a good question and a challenging one, because we've had that, for example, in Norway, where we were restricted on the number of passengers, or in Denmark, be it on trams or on buses. It's very hard to monitor because you can bypass the bus stop for a driver of a bus if the bus is full. But yet, of course, that rule has to have exceptions, because if you find a kid at a bus stop, then who would want to leave a kid at a bus stop? We've seen people also get angry at capacity limitations and start kicking the trams or the cars when not being able to board them. And that's why we are so much in favor, if you like, of face masks, because they are at least, even when social distancing is challenging, an easy recipe and a standard one. In Germany, on our trains, initially, government had mandated social distancing on the trains, but well, had not mandated the wearing of masks, and there we were concerned that things were going to be unworkable. Very quickly, 2 weeks into the experience, face masks were made compulsory, and social distancing is not. And yeah, we do see a level of nervousness with passengers at times, but the level of nervousness is much lower when the capacity is when face masks are worn, and we have not yet found the ideal capacity containment on modes that carry big loads of passengers, 800, 1,000 on a very busy metro. Well, the regulation of the flows ahead of the station are possible, but time-consuming and staff-consuming. Again, the best recipe for us has been face covering.
Now, I'm just conscious of time, but I think we've got sufficient time for one final question. So to wrap up, are there particular countries that have stood out positively in managing COVID-19, and what did they do well?
Well, for us, the countries that have that we look at as having managed very well. Well, I was talking about Australia and New Zealand as good examples, really, and just the crisis in general, but also PTAs, if you like, whom we have. Well, some negotiations have been difficult and hard, but in the end, we have found agreements, and we're happy to move forward with them. So Australia and New Zealand certainly have nothing to be ashamed of. We've looked at Germany and Denmark as excellent references with a good culture of public transport, with a good culture of the cooperation between operators, of common approaches to governments, with governments listening and finding measures and balanced approaches, as well as populations with a good civic sense. Luckily for us, I'd say all the countries where we operate have been good partners and good references, but the very good ones that I've just mentioned, be it Australia, New Zealand, or Germany, Denmark, may stand out.
That's great, thank you. It's certainly been a challenging time for everyone. Look, on behalf of everyone that's dialed in today, and of course the Australasian Railway Association, I'd like to thank you sincerely for your time, Bernard. It's been very insightful, and I appreciate your many responses to the various questions that we had that came through. I think it indicates the level of interest in the topic. So that sort of wraps us up for today. As I mentioned at the start, you can download Bernard's presentation from the handouts tab on the right hand side there. We will send out an email with a feedback survey, and we will send out a link to the webinar that Bernard has presented for us today. I'll just highlight the 3 words that you highlighted, Bernard, being humility, agility, and vigilance. And I think that's something that we can probably take with ourselves into every areas of our lives, whether it's COVID, or whether it's work, or whether it's our personal lives. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. We do have another webinar this week on Wednesday. It is the role of the ATSB now and into the future. So we hope that you can join us then. If not, we look forward to speaking to you again soon. And thank you again, Bernard. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you all.
Take care.